Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's edition of the Sunday Wire. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We're streaming out live on the Alternate Current Radio Network. We're also streaming out at 21stcenturywire.com and X, Rumble, YouTube, Facebook Live, and also BitChute, as well as the audio streams. Thank you again for rejoining us. This is episode 536 of this weekly omnibus news and analysis radio program, again brought to you here on ACR. We're going to run with the first hour, and we're going to be talking about U.S. politics, geopolitics, and then after the break in Overdrive, we'll be joined hopefully by one of our team members to break down the latest in the Middle East and also the foreign policy front as it develops around the world. Certainly, we are living in very interesting times. There is no shortage of action, as Steve Bannon says, flood the zone. This is exactly what's happening with this new Trump administration. And with so much going on as well, it's great to get a good perspective. And the perspective that we like is the transatlantic perspective. And one of the great journalists right now, I think, on this front regarding Europe, U.S. foreign policy, is Thomas Fazi. And he'll be joining us right now on the live link. We're going to bring him up on stage.
Hey, Patrick. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
It's great to be with you as well, Thomas. And there's been, as we said, no shortage of action right now. I mean, a lot of people are surprised. And I know you've been writing on so many different aspects of what's going on right now with European politics, geopolitics. What's your general sort of feeling with the first month of the Trump administration so far from the European perspective, but also if you want to weigh in really on the U.S. domestic perspective, but your overall impressions so far?
Well, it's probably been crazier than most of us expected, even though, you know, we had some expectations of how Trump was likely to, you know, take a sledgehammer at the international, not just the domestic status quo, but also the international status quo. And he has clearly done that. I would say, yeah, even exceeding most people's expectations or fears, depending on your point of view, you know, for the good and the bad. You know, we've seen some, you know, incredibly insane statements and, you know, concerning obviously Gaza and Palestine and, you know, annexionist claims over, you know, Panama, Greenland, and other countries. You know, putting aside Palestine and Israel, where we're simply witnessing continuity with the Biden administration in many respects. On, you know, I wouldn't focus too much on what, even though, you know, a lot of people have had hysterical reactions to those statements, and of course they are, you know, worrying in and of themselves. You know, the desire to take over Greenland and then other countries. But of course, he hasn't acted upon them yet. So, you know, maybe we shouldn't attach too much importance to everything that Trump says, and we should focus on what he does. And of course, when it comes to, you know, concrete action in the foreign policy arena, it's his major action so far has, of course, been taking very concrete steps to try to bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end. And that can only be considered an unquestionably positive thing. Of course, you know, we haven't brought that war to an end yet, but of course, just taking steps towards bringing it to an end is an incredibly positive development. I mean, we're talking about potentially bringing an end to the bloodiest war on European soil since World War II, which has caused, you know, untold destruction, untold bloodshed on both sides, massive economic consequences for Europe, for ordinary Europeans. So, you know, Europeans should only rejoice at the prospect of that war coming to an end. And instead, we're seeing the exact opposite. We're seeing what I have recently termed peace derangement syndrome, where European leaders seem to be, you know, losing their minds at the very idea that the war in Ukraine could come to an end. You know, so at the moment, you know, I'm not writing any blank checks. You know, after Trump, I mean, I'm very much on the same page as you are on this topic. You know, in the sense that I will judge him on what he does, and I think he'll do good things, and he'll do probably very, very insanely bad things as well, as most U.S. presidents do. So we'll wait and see. So, but when it comes to Ukraine, I'm honestly shocked. I'm more concerned at the moment about Europe and European leadership than I am about Trump. As a European, I'm way more scared by our own leaders than by Trump. Incredibly more scared, because I think they've gone insane. I mean, I think this reaction can, of course, be explained in rational terms, and it's quite simple to understand. European leaders have staked so much on this war, again, which, I mean, if we at least were winning this war, maybe they'd be able to find a way to spin it. But because even Trump himself is now admitting that we have lost this war, NATO has lost this war. It's you can understand why European leaders, purely from a kind of a survival standpoint, can't admit that the policies that they've been doubling down on for the past 3 years have proven completely futile. They haven't brought any benefit whatsoever to Ukraine. They've caused massive destruction to Europe, economic destruction to Europe. They've rendered Europe more geopolitically marginalized and really disregarded, and they've made Europe into the world's laughingstock because, of course, everyone can see that Europe just blindly followed the US into this proxy war, despite the fact that it had nothing whatsoever to gain from it. I mean, from the standpoint of what can be considered kind of Europe's objective economic and security core interests. Of course, I'm sure the individual leaders might have, benefited in some way, or will benefit in the future, maybe in some lucrative position in the military-industrial complex or something. But in terms of Europe's interests, I mean, it's even a child could have told back then, and can tell even more clearly now, that there was no. It made no sense for Europe to follow America into this war, especially considering that this war, I think, from the U.S. standpoint, or at least from the standpoint of the previous administration, wasn't just a war aimed at using Ukraine to weaken Russia. It was a war that was aimed at using this conflict also to weaken Europe and to drive a wedge between Europe, and especially Germany and Russia. So Europe followed America into a war that was partly, targeted at Europe itself. I mean, it's hard to imagine being more of a vassal than that. So in purely rational terms, I mean, you can see why European leaders, they're already not faring too well in terms of public support and just overall legitimacy and consensus. I would say this is probably the most hated political class that Europe has ever seen, at least since World War II. And so this would be political suicide for them to say, okay, yeah, actually it was a mistake. We destroyed the European economy. We caused millions of Europeans to fall into poverty, while at the same time causing hundreds of thousands of people to die on both fronts. Absolutely, not even for nothing, but to actually damage ourselves. So they can't do that. So they have to double down. So in purely rational terms, it makes sense. Also, and I would add, sort of in terms of a rational explanation, that precisely because they are so delegitimized, keeping the fear high, keeping the fear of Russia high, trying to maintain, kind of stoking up fears about an imminent Russian invasion is, of course, also a way of trying to hold on to power. Just using fear to hold on to a grip on power, basically. This is something that politicians have done throughout history, of course, often dreaming up or creating an external, a fictional external enemy as a way to control the domestic population. Of course, America has done this for most of its history, and Europeans are doing the same. I think they see I think they're staking their hopes on the fact that thanks to Russia, they may be able to repress and control the population more than they would be otherwise, and maybe even cancel elections in the future, which may which may not go the way they want them to go. They've already done that in Romania and threatened to do that in Germany, which is heading to the polls. And so you can see why. I mean, there are some rational explanations for why they would follow this insane policy, but at the same time, I think there's also an irrational element, especially because this game of chicken with Russia is so insanely dangerous. On some level, it's hard to explain in purely rational terms. And so, and I think again, we have to try to get into the mind of a vassal, and again, just imagine that you've been a diligent, the most diligent employee in the entire office, just doing whatever your boss told you, regardless of whether that hurt your interests, and so you've been you've been employee of the month for the past 3 years, and now there's a change of management. A new boss comes in and starts berating you for doing exactly what the previous boss had told you to do. You can see how that would cause most people to have a mental breakdown, and I think that kind of also explains, peace derangement syndrome. And then we have a lot of psychological parallels. You could, one could think, I mean, Europe has been in this kind of master-slave relationship with America for so long. I mean, essentially since World War II, even though we've never reached the lows that we're witnessing now, but of course Europe has always been in a subordinate relationship to America. And so I think now that Trump is threatening to completely kind of upend that relationship, including by threatening to disengage from Europe, which of course is something that I don't think he's going to do, unfortunately, because I'm happy to see America shut down. It's dozens and dozens of military bases, and it's occupation forces that it still has on European soil since World War II. I kind of fear that that's not going to happen. He simply wants us to pay more for those bases and for those U.S. forces to remain in Europe. But you can see why once you've been in a if you've been in a subordinate relationship for so long, and that once that relationship comes to an end, it's easy to see how you could continue suffering from sort of an equivalent of Stockholm syndrome in a way, where you've internalized the logic of the master to such an extent that you can't you can't do without it, and the idea of that master not controlling you anymore can actually cause you a lot of suffering. And so I think, and also all this grandstanding and this posturing and we're gonna double down on Ukraine, and we're gonna support Ukraine even more than the US has supported it until now. Even this, I think, is in a way, it's almost as if Europeans are subconsciously, trying to regain America's approval under Trump by, trying to, out America America in a way by showing that yes, we're not the pussies that you always accused us of being, and now we're really gonna show you that we can be as American as you have always wanted us to be. And we can make a lot of other examples. So I think I think there are various levels that we can sort of use to understand what's happening in Europe, but either way, it's incredibly concerning, and I think we shouldn't underestimate just the potential that Europe has at the moment for derailing these peace talks. Because of course people are right when they say Europe has no way of, financially and militarily, allowing this war to continue. Of course, I mean, if NATO as a whole, with America, hasn't been able to secure a Ukrainian victory on the battlefield, how the hell can a purely European NATO, which has which doesn't even come close in terms of the military production that the US has, and even if we just were to buy all the stuff from the US, I mean, Europe has big financial issues at the moment, and of course it's it's not going to happen, of course, and but at the same time, I think there still is a potential for Europe to be able to, if not derail, seriously complicate these talks. I think there are factions within Ukraine that will continue fighting no matter what. So you can see how you could reach a formal agreement between, which the Ukrainian government subscribes to. But then you can imagine that the conflict continues in a form of sort of guerrilla warfare, with European governments playing a role there. And even if the conflict really comes to a full stop, which I think might be quite hard, but even if that succeeds, Europe is still fucked in terms of its relationship with Russia, because with the current European leadership, we're still looking at a scenario of permanently antagonistic and militarized relations with Russia, which of course poses security risks in the sense that, it means, you don't want to have a North Korea-like situation between not just Ukraine and Russia, but Europe and Russia, with the entire kind of Russian-European border being a potential sort of hotspot. But when you've got the current European foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas saying just a few weeks ago that Russia should be broken up into 6 mini states and that would be the best outcome, and you've got virtually every European leader saying virtually every day that we have to prepare for a Russian invasion that is described as being almost inevitable, and in fact certain. Sort of you can see the risks there. As much as willing as Russia may be to reach peace and to renormalize relations, in this context, it's simply impossible. So of course, there's Europe is undergoing a lot of political upheavals, and there are upcoming elections in a number of countries. So the scenario might change, but honestly, I mean, in the very short term, I don't think it's going to change that much. I mean, everyone's talking about these German elections, but we're still most likely going to have another center right, center left grand coalition with the AfD in opposition, and of course that's going to apply some pressure on the government. But we're not going to have this massive change of leadership. It's not going to be a paradigm change in Germany. I think, especially considering that Merz is, the likely future chancellor of Germany is essentially a BlackRock man who's spent his life serving U.S. financial and corporate interests, and a diehard Atlanticist who has, taken hyper hawkish positions on Ukraine. To this day. So again, let's not overestimate, the likelihood of, imminent political change in Europe. So this is I think kind of where we're at. So very interesting and potentially positive times, but also very dangerous times.
Yeah, it seems like there's a kind of potential fork in the road for Europe. I mean, it's like Ukraine has allowed the rudderless kind of European looking for a purpose, the Union looking for a purpose, and Ukraine kind of provided that temporary hit, that dopamine hit for European leadership, as you said, very lukewarm leadership, and it provided that purpose. And even with Brexit, this Trump spat has brought Keir Starmer together with Macron in their emergency meeting, and it's almost like all our past differences are healed now. We're together for democracy and saving Ukraine, but at the same time, the U.S. is putting pressure on them. So the U.S. pulls out, says we're not going to tangle militarily with Russia, but the U.S. is saying you need to spend 5% of GDP on NATO budget. So it's like the protection racket without the protection, basically. So you pay up. But why would Russia be a threat to Europe if the US has got some kind of rapprochement going between Moscow and Washington? It seems like Europe is safe at that point. So who's really the driving force behind the tension at this point? Is there a fork in the road here, and which way is Europe going to go?
Yeah. No, I mean, let's be clear about that. I mean, Russia poses no realistic military threat to Europe. If by that we mean, Russian tanks rolling through Berlin, which is something that German politicians talk about with a straight face. Like, if we don't ramp up military spending, we're going to have the Russians, rolling into Berlin once more. And that, says a lot, I guess, about the kind of, subconscious associations that they make in their mind with previous moments of German history. But it's completely insane. I mean, honestly, Russia not only doesn't have the means to sort of mount a massive land invasion of Western Europe. I mean, it's hard to even talk about it without laughing, but clearly it doesn't have the intent to do it. Why would Russia want to, take over Europe, just because, and the only explanation that we usually get is because Putin is utterly crazy, and he'll do it, just for the kick of it. I mean, I mean, these are not serious discussions at all. And then, of course, one could argue, okay, but Russia may not want to, may not have the means to invade Europe, but of course it can strike Europe with a missile. It can strike any European capital with a missile. Yes, of course it could do that. It does have the technical means to do that. I would still argue it doesn't have any reason to do that now. But of course, it does have the means to do that, which of course is the key reason why you want to have the Tente with Russia, why you want to normalize relations with this huge nuclear armed country which possesses the means to destroy Europe. You want to make peace, you want to normalize relations with this country as soon as possible. Now, Russia has no intention of just launching a random missile attack on Europe, because, of course, that would probably be, the beginning of a world-destroying nuclear war. And I don't think Russia has, a death wish in that sense. I mean, I think European leaders seem to have a much bigger death wish than Putin does. And again, I think there's, we could talk a lot about the psychological aspects of the death wish drive that we have seen in Europe over the past 3 years. I think there's a lot, has a lot to do with the kind of nihilistic culture that has taken over the West. But that's another story. But again, so it's, it's the irrationality of this. So on the one hand, you're saying Putin is absolutely crazy, while at the same time constantly poking him and attacking him, and saying that we have to prepare for for a war or for an attack that is considered to be inevitable. Now you can see what that makes sense. Like, even if you believe that, you wouldn't say it openly, because all you're telling your supposed existential enemy is to preemptively attack you before you have the means to attack him. So I mean, honestly, I mean, I don't see that happening in the short term, but clearly, I mean, the current European leadership could pose potentially, I mean, down the road, a serious risk to Russia, because they are so unhinged. So I think it is a very dangerous situation, and you're right to ask, like, who is driving this? I think that's an interesting question, because of course, if you assume that America is the executive, and it's always been sort of the White House giving orders to Europe, then now that there's been a change of regime in the White House, then you should expect now there's new orders coming in, and everyone should just fall in line. So I think we partly tried to explain why that is not happening in the immediate short term, but I think we also have to think of America not as this monolithic bloc, and certainly not as a bloc where the White House is the only driving force of U.S. foreign policy, right? I think, European countries, European leaders, European states, and the apparatuses, the intelligence and military apparatuses within those states, don't just have long-standing linkages with the formal institutions of power in America. They also have long-standing linkages with the more secretive institutions of American power, the American deep state. So you've got, of course, political linkages, at the executive level, and those have always existed clearly. But you've also got, in a way, really deep and strong linkages, between the U.S. deep state and the European deep states. So it's not inconceivable to think that they're also receiving orders from other channels, and if not orders, pressures from other channels, even within America, who may have an interest in derailing peace talks with Russia. I'm pretty sure that the U.S. military-industrial complex, which we know to be incredibly influential, isn't that happy about the prospect of billions of dollars of arms sales coming to a stop. It's a disaster for them. And of course, let's not forget that Europe has its own military-industrial complex. Of course, it's not as big or powerful as America's, but it's the one that has grown in relative terms much more thanks to the Ukraine war than the American military-industrial complex. So if you look at the stock market value of companies like Rheinmetall in Germany, Leonardo in Italy, and other arms manufacturers across Europe, the value of their stocks has jumped much more than the value of American arms manufacturers, because we never had such a colossal war just in Europe. So for them, it's been huge. And so just as the U.S. military-industrial complex, of course, exercises a strong influence, these companies also exercise strong influence on European politics. So I think, it's a slightly more complex picture, also in terms of understanding transatlantic relations, than just, it's not just about who is sitting in the White House. I think there are a number of sites of power, sites of influence, sites of pressure, and they're not all, even in America, and they're not all aligned with Trump. So I think that's also another issue to take into consideration. But yes, we are at a fork road, and honestly, it's hard to be optimistic in the short term. It really is. It really is. I mean, without regime change across Europe, it's really hard to imagine that this could end well. I mean, the most likely prospect, so barring the more extreme scenarios of nuclear annihilation and outright war with Russia, which at the moment, luckily, is still quite a far scenario, but it's one that could come into being, I think, further down the road if we continue down this path. But just one where Europe remains completely economically and politically cut off from Russia, from its natural neighbor with whom it has a sort of a natural interest in strengthening relations with. And this is tragic. I mean, I think it's truly tragic. I mean, I know that there are different sentiments across Europe when it comes to Russia, and this is one of Europe's problems. We speak of Europe as a monolith, and again, I mean, from a psychological standpoint, I do understand why, I don't know, the Baltics or certain Eastern countries fear Russia. Again, I think it's irrational. It doesn't make for good foreign policy. But I can understand it on a psychological level. I mean, just as I can understand, an individual who's been a victim of trauma, and and that can pass down through generations, and this is kind of psychology 101. I mean, it's not. But at the same time, I think that politics to try to rise above that, because irrational fears, driven by historical traumas, don't make for good foreign policy. But I do understand it. But Western Europe has a very, very different relationship with Russia. We have none of those sort of historical traumas, historical fears. In fact, for many people in my country, Italy, Russia has always been a country with whom we've always had a deep, intimate connection on a cultural level, through literature, through music, through other forms of arts. Politically, of course, because Western Europe, for a long time, had very powerful socialist and communist countries, which obviously had ties to Russia, which also translated then into economic ties between Italy and Russia and other Western European countries and Russia. So for me, what is I think this is probably ultimately, of course, the bloodshed and the destruction is absolutely tragic, but I think what's for Europe's future, I think what's most tragic is the fact that really, I mean, if America, or at least the previous administration, even though I think this is a strategy that goes further back than the Biden administration, because America has always had this kind of geostrategic imperative of maintaining Russia and Europe separated, and this outcome has been achieved. Like, whatever happens, I think the American state, which sort of transcends individual administrations, has succeeded in achieving that goal. That goal has been achieved, and this will remain a fact of sort of European geopolitics, I think, for a very long time. We're gonna need a complete regime change across at least major, at least Western European countries, which start and which can start mending relations with Russia, but it's going to take a long time, and Russia is understandably going to be very distrustful of any sort of overtures coming from Europe. It's given what the betrayal of the Minsk agreements and all that story. So that's why it's kind of hard to be optimistic, and it makes me say that the US might have failed a lot of its goals in this war, especially its goal of weakening Russia, if not defeating it. I'm not sure if they ever really truly believed they could defeat Russia. I think they were just happy with bleeding Russia as much as possible. But they've clearly achieved what was one of their overarching goals, which was to separate Europe and Russia for good, or at least for a very long time, and they've succeeded that. And in a way, now Trump can reap the benefits of that, while at the same time making peace with Russia. I mean, you got to give it to the Americans. I mean, clearly they're smarter than the Europeans, obviously. So now, he can swoop in and actually, mend relations. Now he's openly talking of lifting sanctions on Russia and reestablishing, economic relations with Russia. So now he's going to benefit from this newfound friendship, while leaving Europe and Russia in the state of enmity, which they themselves, contributed to a large degree. But of course, we allowed ourselves to be taken for a ride. So in a way, we deserve everything we've got coming.
It's incredible. I mean, what a move! They always make jokes about Trump's 5D chess, and I don't know if it's the intended effect, but that Trump has this effect just by his bolshiness and this unpredictability and his willingness to kind of impose his administration's will on the situation. That, quite frankly, nobody's used to this for so many years compared to the Biden administration. And previous Trump administration was, I think, handcuffed most of the time, very ineffectual, having to overcompensate and be more anti-Russian just to prove to the Democrats and the impeachment mobs that he wasn't a secret agent of the Kremlin. Yeah. But this is totally different. This is a different situation. But Munich Security Conference, the Davos of defense, this roadshow came into Europe recently, and you penned an article that caused quite a few waves. Maybe one of the biggest, most read articles I think that you have written, Thomas. J.D. Vance's Munich speech was full of contradictions. And while this was an interesting article, and you brought up some very important points, which I hope you'll summarize here, but what was even more surprising was the reaction in the comment threads on X that the vice president himself inserted himself into the conversation. So tell us about this article, and then, how surprised were you that you were interacting with the number 2 in power in the United States? Go ahead, Thomas.
Yes, it was, again, clear sign of the incredibly weird times that we're living, that the American vice president would take the time to respond to an article a critical article by a journalist. And I think, again, maybe this points to the sort of radical sort of authority of this administration compared to the previous one, because it's, it would have been unimaginable for anyone in the previous administration, any top official, at least the previous administration, engaging with a journalist on X. So let's take this as a positive sign. In my article, I was sort of responding. I wasn't responding to Vance himself, because I didn't think he would have read the article, even though I guess he did end up reading it. But I was more trying to engage with this kind of knee-jerk reaction that I saw in a lot of the dissident or communities in Europe, just clapping at Vance's speech, saying, what a fantastic speech. Yeah, he's sticking it, to those European tyrants. He's telling it like it is, accusing them of being a bunch of, censorious freaks who are, arresting people for posts on social media, and even arresting people for silent praying in the UK, which Vance spoke about in his talk. And, he even calls out the Europeans for, essentially cancelling the elections in Romania and threatening to cancel all the elections in Germany. And he was clearly referring to Thierry Breton's statement there about this. And so now I can understand why a lot of us who have been, criticizing these policies for a long time, why we would feel a sense of, Schadenfreude at seeing, European leaders getting berated by their master, and getting told, and hearing them say from the American vice president what we have been writing and talking about for so long. Yes, of course, I also got a kick out of this, but I think we also, need to be a bit more cool-headed. And what I said in the article was that, as much as I subscribe to a lot of what Vance was saying about Europe, I think there were some parts that were missing from his talk, and primarily America's key role in often driving these policies. We take Romania. Clearly, I don't think Europe or the EU took the lead on Romania. I think the U.S. State Department, took the lead in pressuring the Romanian government to cancel the elections. I don't think it was I think Europeans were simply really following America's lead on a lot of these policies. Of course, we know, the crucial role that NATO, which has always been kind of, a Washington-led organization, played in driving the kind of, censorship industrial complex. And, Mike Pence has, spoken a lot about this. And so the idea that all these policies, are kind of homegrown, or solely Europe's responsibilities, I found a bit rich. I think it's, and I felt like Vance was kind of whitewashing America's role in bringing about a lot of these policies. And yeah, surprisingly, after a couple of days, that the article was published, Vance himself replied to the article on X, and saying that he thought the accusations were unfair. Because he says, but in my speech, I mentioned that the Biden administration was also engaged in censorship. That was kind of the gist of his argument. Yes, that's true. But still, what we're talking about here is something a bit bigger than that. Yes, of course, you're criticizing your previous administration. They're your arch enemies. What I'm talking about here is specifically, America's role in bringing about not just these specific policies. And that's what I told him in my response to his response. I was like, look, I mean, regardless, this is something that goes even way further back than the Biden administration. I mean, I think if Europe has such a, feckless leadership today, it's also because the US has spent the last decades, essentially since World War II, trying to, exercise its influence, its economic, political, and military influence over Europe. And over time, this has bred a deeply infantilized political class, which exactly has sort of, accustomed itself to being, really a completely to be completely subordinate to the US. And this is why, I mean, they allowed themselves to just blindly follow the Biden administration into and even the previous administrations into the disaster of the Ukraine proxy war. But we have to understand that this has deeper roots. Under previous generations of political leadership in Europe, I mean, I would argue that this would never have happened. And in fact, for example, I mean, I think that it's questionable even if Angela Merkel, sort of the last old school European statist, would have, allowed Germany to be pulled in so deep into this. But that's another story, But and so my point, my final point of Vance was, look, I mean, this is ultimately if Europeans have to take, we're never going to get out of the situation unless Europeans take their own fate into their own hands, and this means or breaking free from US control and domination, which has been ongoing for decades, and which is one of the key reasons why we have such a poor political class. And again, I mean, I think it's important to stress, and we could speak hours about how the US has gone about bringing this situation of control. And it's not just something that naturally evolved out of America's, soft power, and that, we just all fell for American hegemony. I mean, we're talking of, numerous, for example, political leaders who were critical of their country's subordination to the US and to NATO, that were murdered, that died in very mysterious circumstances. Italy has a long history of anyone that was critical of US domination literally being killed off,
Sweden
by the CIA. So this is the kind of influence that we're talking about, right? I mean, this is not
Swedish former Swedish PM Olof Palme, and the list goes on. So
every country has at least one, major political leader that died in, at least, who was critical of America and died in mysterious circumstances. So this is what we're talking about. And so, so I think the point is, if you're serious about what you're saying, let's acknowledge the whole history of how we got to this point and America's responsibilities in this. And as I think, Arnaud Bertrand, he sort of added to this. I think he said, very poignant. He made a very poignant argument. He was like, look, I mean, it's like, even just because you've had elections in a country, just because, if a country bombs another country or, invades another country, just because then you have an election in the country that invaded, that new government doesn't get to accuse the bombed country of being responsible for the sorry state that it's in. I'm not saying it's a completely perfect analogy, of course, it's slightly more complex here, but, this is kind of what we saw, I mean, because there's a new administration, then as a country, as a state, we have no historical responsibility because we didn't do it, as in, Trump and JD Vance. Yes, I know you guys didn't do it, but at the same time, you belong to, your leaders of a country that has, a long history, and I think you have to acknowledge that history, and you can't just say that's nothing to do with that, to do with us, because we weren't there or it didn't happen under our watch. And so the question, moving forward for Europe is, is America really interested in, giving Europe autonomy, or is all this talk of, as you were saying, disengagement from Europe and disengagement from NATO just a way of changing the form of US control without changing the substance? And again, talking of meddling in European politics, I'm sorry, and this is not about taking sides, whether one prefers, the populist sort of mainstream. I think it's clear how much, I hate the current European political mainstream. But at the same time, I mean, current US administration is openly supporting sort of a new generation of populist parties in Europe, right? And regardless of what we think of those parties, this is, again, a clear form of foreign interference. So again, you can see the contradictions. And this is another contradiction, I think, in Vance's arguments. He was like, yes, I mean, the previous administration, meddled a lot in European politics, but we're not going to do that. But at the same time, I'm basically doing a speech where I'm telling the entire European political, current leadership to step aside and let, our new friends come to power in Europe, and that'll solve all the problems. Yeah, it might solve the problems in terms, for America, but it won't solve European problems, regardless of whether these new parties might pursue to some degree better policies, but it won't change the underlying dynamics of European-American relations. If we simply have a change of regime in Europe, but and so we have a new generation of political leaders that come to power with different different policy ideas, but who still subscribe to the idea that who are still psychologically subordinated to Washington. And I think there's a very real risk of this happening. As we saw, in the AfD leaders fawning, over Musk and Trump, and numerous similar examples of that.
Well, I knew you were alluding to Elon Musk there, and this is his virtual appearance at the AfD rally.
Yeah.
And, he really rails on George Soros a lot. He's been tweeting about Soros, and Soros is doing this, Soros is doing that. But isn't Elon Musk playing the role of Soros, but for the right wing of the political conversation? But in the end, it's all for Uncle Sam, as it was for George and it is for Elon. And this idea that the richest man in the world can donate or bundle $250 million to the Trump campaign, which is equivalent to what the Israeli lobby have put together for the Trump campaign, and buy himself a seat in the White House and make the White House a co-work space for himself. It's kind of a new thing, and Thomas, yeah. I'm an old-fashioned American, and I'm not so comfortable with that prospect. It is stepping into a new domain in terms of the corporativism, to steal. I didn't mean to steal that term from the former Italian leader back in the Second World War, but it's akin to fascism in that sort of orthodox definition sense. Yeah. And I think this is worth addressing, and there's legitimate criticisms, because if you're going to govern, you have to govern for everybody and not just one particular interest class. I mean, it's a good question to end on here, Thomas, but what are your feelings about tech bros and this kind of trend and the accumulation of wealth and influence and power?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's, I think I see this administration as being kind of a mask-off moment for American power. We see this in the foreign policy arena, where Trump, openly says what previous administrations would do without admitting that they were doing it, and in fact, while saying that they were doing the exact opposite. So whether it's ends up being better or worse for the rest of the world, I think will remain to be seen. But I think honesty is something that we can work with, and Trump openly stating what his aims are in terms of raw, naked kind of geopolitical interests. I think that's hopefully something that will make it clearer to most people how America operates. Again, I don't see a fundamental change in terms of actual policies and actual kind of geopolitical imperatives. I mean, the tactical changes, but I think the kind of hegemonic drive remains the same. But in terms of sort of the domestic organization of power, again, it's a mask-off moment. I mean, of course, America has always been an oligarchy and has increasingly so over the past few decades. Biden administration was just as much beholden to American oligarchs as the current Trump administration is. But again, the difference was that under previous administrations, especially under the Biden administration, they operated sort of behind the scenes. They operated in the shadows, even though they were, of course, just as influential as Musk is, for example, over the current Trump administration. So again, Musk, the richest man in the world, the number one sort of tech oligarch in the world, setting up shop inside the White House, and even openly like telling Trump what to do, and almost like speaking down to him on some occasions. It's a mask-off moment. I mean, this is not a sort of a radical paradigm change in the sense that this has always been going on behind the scenes, but now we're seeing, now we can all see it happening, live, right? And again, this is, I think, useful. So when you see liberals, and even Biden in his farewell speech complaining about, the oligarchic takeover of America, now that's a fanciful take. I mean, that's quite laughable, because America had already been taken over by oligarchs. I would say, especially under Biden, but of course, they just the Biden administration was about putting up, a simulacrum of how power operates. In a way, Trump has done away with the simulacrum, and he's just like openly, he's sort of taking down the veil and showing the world, just openly showing the world how American power operates and the influence that oligarchs have over American power. So I think it's of course it's concerning. I mean, but again, I see this as sort of an extreme degeneration of a trend that has been ongoing for a long time, and ultimately it's a reminder that America is not a democracy. I mean, it's not, you're not a democracy. Democracy is not just about being allowed to vote. It should be, democracy should be about being given a chance to truly access, the corridors of power for ordinary people, for working classes, for the masses to truly access the corridors of power. And instead, what we have in America, as in most Western democracies, is the only choice we're offered, if that, is between two different factions of the elites, two different factions of the oligarchy. So so ultimately, what the previous election was in America was essentially a battle. It was an election between two different factions of the oligarchy. Biden responded to kind of certain factions, older factions of the American oligarchy, of the American elite. Trump represents the sort of newer, the oligarchic startups in a way. So there's a new generation of oligarchs who want a greater piece of the pie, and this is what a lot of what is happening behind the scenes is about. It's about these new oligarchs wanting a greater share of the pie at the expense of other older factions of the oligarchy. But we shouldn't be mistaken about the fact that ultimately this is what it is. It's a clash of different factions of the elite.
Yes, and we can only hope that this faction is more benevolent and thoughtful and considerate than the previous faction. And there are some very positive indications initially, but I reserve my judgment, as I'm sure you do, for the midterms, and we'll see how things develop. But we'll take the W's, but we'll also be very vigilant in kind of surveying the situation. But Thomas Fazi, regular columnist at Unheard, it's a great publication. There's a lot of great writers there, Thomas being one of the best, I would say, and also Substack, Thomas Fazi. You want to visit here and follow him as well at Battle for Europe on X. You'll see, we'll bring his lower third back there, Battle for Europe. Just go visit and follow Thomas. Some great takes, folks, and great conversations that Thomas is right in the middle of. So we really appreciate you joining us on the Sunday Wire this week, Thomas.
Thank you, Patrick. It was a pleasure.
And there he goes, ladies and gentlemen. That is Thomas Fazi. And we're going to be transitioning now to a break. And when we come back in Overdrive, we will continue the conversation about the most important stories, both domestically in the U.S., in Europe, and internationally as well. I'm Patrick Henningsen. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
For in the final analysis, we all inhabit this small planet, and we are all mortal.
Lately I've been watching the world gone mad. Brothers and sisters full to take a stand, to hate their fellow man, another man. Divide and conquer is the acronym plan. Distract the people, control the story. Don't believe your lying eyes, you know me. Pushing us to turn to good. Corruption and lies, truth is the crime, will turn to gold. Well-designed misery to keep you on edge, make you believe anything anyone says. Keep it left or right, not top or bottom. Accuse the victim, can't you see we got 'em? Stay in power, no matter what. Playing with the doomsday clock. Turn a blind eye and gamble your trust, pushing us to turn to blood. With captured rights, feudals like time will turn to dust. Industrialized brutality, commercialized cruelty, people as commodity, cheer on war and atrocity, no accountability, perpetual impunity, always have an enemy, to hell with all humanity. Stay in power, no matter what, playing with the doomsday clock. Turn a blind eye and gamble your trust, pushing us to turn to good.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Sunday Wire again. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We're streaming out live on the Alternate Current Radio Network. We're also streaming out live right now on X, also Rumble, YouTube, Facebook Live on our fan page, 21st Century Wire on Facebook, and I believe BitChute as well. So we're on all those live video streams as well as some of the audio streams. And you can also catch us after the fact at 21stcenturywire.com. We're also on iTunes. You can subscribe to the audio podcast there, Spotify, any of the major podcasting networks. We're there. The Sunday Wire is there, and soon the Midweek Wire, which we've just launched. We're in our fourth week now, I think, fifth week. That will also be available on those audio podcast subscriptions as well. But thank you for rejoining us. And what a tremendous segment with Thomas Fazi, a very talented journalist, talented writer, has a great take, great viewpoint on Europe, U.S. politics, and Britain, the EU. He has just a great overall spectrum that he looks at when he calculates what's going on in the world. We're really privileged to have him on to talk about this very important issue. And I think that's really an excellent segment. If you missed any of that live interview, which just broadcast now a few minutes ago, you can catch that, of course, afterwards when the recording's available afterwards. But we're going to be joined by one of our teammates, Basil Valentine, for the same topic discussion. Obviously, Basil is the new political editor at the Today, so we'll have him on to discuss that. But there's a couple of points that we didn't have time to make during Thomas's segment, but are very important. And it was regarding the reaction to his article about J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference. And Thomas's criticisms, I think, were spot on. And I was surprised to see J.D. Vance, Vice President of the United States, weigh in the comment threads. I mean, really surprising. And he also weighed in with Neil Ferguson, who is with the Hoover Institution, and also who was with the Viktor Pinchuk think tank in Ukraine before the war started. So Neil Ferguson's got a little conflict of interest there. But nonetheless, he is a arch globalist, more on the kind of neoconservative side. And J.D. Vance kind of will put this up on screen here. He did a quote tweet about one of the comments Neil Ferguson made on the Ukraine war. And, I'm impressed by Vance's intellectual capability to actually learn and comprehend things, which, let's face it, it's very rare for politicians these days to be able to do that. So he does have this ability, and he does have a lot of the makings of a formidable intellectual politician, possibly a good president one day. It's too early to tell. We'll see how he performs. We'll see how the Trump administration performs in the next 2 or 3 years before the next election cycle begins. But a couple of points I would hit home if we had more time, would have brought this up with Thomas Fazi. But one of the criticisms I had about Vance's speech is, and not just to J.D. Vance, but to all the European leaders too. Anybody who's railing about the immigration issue, you hear this, the immigration issue. We must do something about the immigration issue. It's a threat to European civilization, and it's changing the ethno-demographic character of our countries. It's transforming our culture. I've said this before. If you watch or listen to our program over the years, I'm no surprise what I'm about to say, but I'll say it again. There's always been immigration. It's one of the interesting attributes of the planet Earth. Throughout history, the history of humanity, there has always been immigration, and often mass immigration. And this has created societies, states, countries, civilizations, regions, city-states, okay, all of the above. So it's really inescapable, okay, unless you want to throw up walls all over the world. It's just a fact of life. Okay. So the question then is how much? And the question is how much and in what period of time? Because this is what causes the political instability. It's the amount of immigration in a short space of time. And it should also be remarked, and we also should discuss why there is immigration. And of course, this is an unpopular topic. Why? Because it tracks back to government. Government, if you haven't noticed yet, would rather have us fighting amongst ourselves, black, white, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, atheist, Christian, brown, white, brown, black, etc., etc. They would Chinese, white American, you name it. Okay, they love seeing us fight each other, tearing each other to pieces, because if we're fighting each other, we're not looking at them, and they are the cause of the economic disparity. Government is the cause of all of these things. Government is the cause of the immigration issue. Okay, the Afghani family that showed up in your village and is staying at a hotel paid for by the government, you can't blame them for wanting to escape the hellhole from which they came. If you don't like it, it's a question of policy. It's a question of the government, and most likely it's the one that you voted for. More than likely, more often than not, it's the one that you voted for. In the UK, the Tory government have presided over this migrant crisis and the last 3 waves of the migrant crisis. But yet the people who are most vocal about the issue, who are the most upset about the issue in the UK, are people who voted Tory, who voted for Boris Johnson, who voted for Brexit. And it seems like, well, looking by the numbers, it's not so clear, but by the media coverage, the anti-immigration media coverage has gone up by leaps and bounds after Brexit. So help me square this circle. It just doesn't make sense, does it? But back to J.D. Vance, back to the German leadership, back to the French leadership. Let's just call these NATO member states: France, Germany, Netherlands, Great Britain, and etc. Sweden, we'll throw them in there because they're in NATO now. Denmark, Poland, okay? All of these countries, but especially the ones I mentioned previously: Spain, Italy, okay? All NATO member states. So if you don't like the immigration, the intense migrant flows, what are the 3 biggest migrant flows in the last, I don't know, let's just say 20 years or so? Well, let's look at that. Iraq, coming from the Middle East, post-Iraq, coming from the post-Afghanistan invasion and occupation during that time. Okay, that's right the way through the 2000s and the 2010s and into the 2020s. Central Europe has been hit by a migrant crisis from Syria, from the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa. So wait a minute. NATO actions in Afghanistan, U.S. NATO actions in Iraq. Okay, that covers the Middle East and Central Asia. Okay, Syria, that's a NATO-backed dirty war lasting over a decade. There's NATO there. Turkey's a NATO member. Turkey was instrumental in the destabilization of Syria. Yes, they facilitated most of it. And all the other NATO member states worked through Turkey. Okay, interesting that. And what about Libya? Well, that's a really important one, because there used to be a country there called Libya. It's gone now. It's there's 3 different sort of statelets, dysfunctional, and all the migrant flows through Africa, from Sub-Saharan Africa, from Sudan, from all these countries, flowing up through Libya. And isn't it funny that Muammar Gaddafi, the president, the leader of Libya, who warned the West, he said, if you topple me, if you take our country down, we are the last backstop against the migrant crisis hitting Europe. We're keeping them in Africa. But you get rid of me and anything can happen. And sure enough, that's what happened. NATO took out an unprovoked war of aggression by NATO, took out Muammar Gaddafi, and we've had unfettered migration flows from Africa through Libya and through this region, this corridor. So those are all NATO actions. So, and this is to J.D. Vance and everybody else who is lecturing us on immigration. Is there not a correlation between foreign policy of NATO member states and immigration flows? Because I think there is, especially in Europe. I think there is. I think there's more than a correlation. I think there is causation. So why doesn't this topic ever come up for discussion at the Munich Security Conference? Why? Why don't they ever bring this up? It's one thing to complain about immigration. It's another thing to talk about what caused it. Why? Why not talk about it? Maybe because it's bad for business. Maybe because it's bad for the defense contractor business, the lucrative military-industrial complex that works through NATO. That's interesting, isn't it? It's bad for business if we talk about this, because if there's no NATO actions in those places, well, there's no migrant crisis. But there's also a higher chance there's going to be less business for the military-industrial complex, the defense giants in America and in Europe. Defense stocks in Europe are surging. Incredible, especially with even talk of Trump pulling out of Ukraine. All of a sudden, European defense stocks are surging. This is the market, folks. It's a dirty business. This is the protection racket that these countries and their corporate arms run. Isn't it interesting? So if we just had different foreign policy, or if we didn't have NATO, we wouldn't have the migrant crisis. Rather than bombing Libya to the Stone Ages and decapitating the leadership, carving it up into dysfunctional statelets, why not help to build up Libya so it is successful, so it can provide more for its population, so it can do more to police its borders and help to control the migrant flows. And by making Libya successful, Muammar Gaddafi was then making Africa successful. And if Africa is successful, less people will want to escape the economic deprivation in those countries. So you see, it's like a vicious cycle that we've created with our foreign policy led by the United States, seconded by the UK, and then the other NATO member states, the minion states, okay, the junior partners along for the ride. And then they'll kick up and complain, people or the AFD, whatever right-wing parties will kick up and complain about immigration. But it's very rare you'll hear any of these right-wing parties complain about the causes of the immigration, i.e. NATO and NATO's actions and U.S. actions in the Middle East, in North Africa and Central Asia and Ukraine. What about those refugees? Well, they don't complain as much about those because they're of a lighter skin tone, obviously. And we've all been told we need to get on side with this effort to defend Ukraine against Russia. So everybody's on message. The propaganda is working for Ukraine. No such campaigns, though, for anybody else who is a victim of an undeclared war of aggression at the hands of, wait for it, NATO. So it's not rocket science, folks. And we're just kind of pointing out the obvious. And there's one more thing. And mind you, I like J.D. Vance. He has great potential. He has a great mind. He has a capacity to learn and to understand geopolitics and to understand what other countries' sensitive needs are, okay? However, there's one thing he didn't mention in his speech, which is this. That's the Nord Stream pipeline. So tell me how you can sit in Germany at the Munich Security Conference and berate European countries and leaders and not mention this, okay? Not mention this, the biggest attack on European infrastructure ever in history, energy infrastructure. Well, there was one which we did cover on the program on the Midweek Wire a week and a half ago with Freddie Ponton and Mats Nilsson, and that is the Yamal pipeline sabotage. That was in 1982, comparable to the Nord Stream, but the scale and size, that was done through a computer hack in 82, much like the Stuxnet virus. This is the Yamal disaster in 82. We'll put that up on screen real quick here. Fascinating story, but Nord Stream was something different. looking at Nord Stream here, looking at this map, the amount of countries that were involved in this, we believe during the Baltops 22 NATO drill, which is where the explosives were prepped and then were detonated later during Northern Coast's drill in September of 2022. And the rest is history, but nobody wants to fess up to it. So how many countries were involved in that NATO drill? Well, all of the NATO members. That was in the summer of 2022, Baltops 2022. So they're all involved, and because they're all involved, everybody's keeping their mouth shut. That's kind of how it works. But this was absolutely, if you believe Seymour Hersh, award-winning, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist, if you believe the general gist of his story, the general gist, you'll know this was a U.S.-led operation. But they weren't alone. There were other NATO member states involved. Okay, the U.S.-led operation most certainly. That many of them, at the very least, have knowledge of everything about it, and I include Denmark and Sweden in that category. Norway, I would say Germany as well, and probably Poland. And that's not to say the British are not involved. I would expect them to be. I'd be shocked if they weren't, especially with that text message to Liz Truss saying it's done. Okay, so the short-lived prime minister, I personally believe that's why she was shuffled out of Downing Street. It wasn't because of the economy. So that's history, folks. That's kind of how things are going to be remembered. So J.D. Vance, vice president, no mention of the Nord Stream pipeline. That has done tremendous damage to the European economy. Taking that offline, all of a sudden making them dependent on, wait a minute, hold on. United States supplied liquefied natural gas. So the Nord Stream sabotage bailed out the U.S. fracking industry, bailed out the U.S. LNG industry. And U.S. became a top supplier of gas at a higher premium, of course. It's more expensive to ship it across the Atlantic than it is to get cheap, reliable, affordable Russian gas via the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines. So what happened? Well, German businesses left. German industry left Germany. Some of it left to the United States. So who benefited? As they say in Latin, qui bono. Qui bono, who benefited from the Nord Stream sabotage? The United States of America materially benefited. Not just benefited, made out like bandits. Yeah, they did. It's beyond debate. So I would go to Europe if it was me, if I was speaking, if I was representing the United States, I would go there with a little more humility. And I would say, oh, and by the way, the Nord Stream sabotage. We regret this is one of the big failures of the Biden administration. And we are going to launch an inquiry and investigation to find out what actually happened. And we will make amends. We will pay reparations. When we find out, we can absolutely confirm who is responsible. Of course, they already know who's responsible. The U.S. Pentagon knows. This was all done via the White House, Joe Biden's White House, but the knowledge, the personnel, the records are there. Okay, but at least give it lip service. If you want to lay it at the feet of the Biden, a senile Joe Biden, go right ahead. If that's what you want to do, and it wouldn't be 100% wrong, to be quite honest. It wouldn't be. Most likely, this was a crazy plan hatched by Joe Biden's bloated National Security Council, led by some of the most incompetent individuals ever to sit in those positions. Okay. And it was just rubber stamped by a senile geriatric pseudo president. So I think you already got a get out of jail free card. But what you do have is a loss of faith in America, but that can be repaired. There's one thing, however, with the Nord Stream pipeline, and especially when you consider, here we go back up on screen, how many people were involved in this, how many NATO members were involved with this. if revelations are ever to happen as to what really went down, how the operation really happened, which will release some of that information this week on 21st Century Wire. Got a report coming out this week that will answer one aspect of this, not the whole story, of course, but one very key and important detail. But my point is, when the truth is known, what this will do to the reputation of NATO as an organization is curtains. It's toast. It's over. The damage Nord Stream revelations will do to NATO as an organization, its legitimacy, its mandate, the ability for members to cooperate and trust the hierarchy of leadership in this organization. No, you'll never overcome the damage that has been done. It is one of the biggest missteps, geopolitical, foreign policy missteps in the history of the modern nation state. And if it's a U.S.-led operation, the U.S. has to own it. Doesn't matter if it's the Trump administration, the Biden administration, or whoever, or the next administration, a Vance administration, whatever. Doesn't matter. You got to own it. Uncle Sam has to own it. He's got to take responsibility for what happened, and all the other states that were involved in the cover-up, like Sweden and Denmark and Germany, and any other states like Great Britain or the Netherlands or Norway that were also directly involved in the sabotage operation during Baltops and afterwards, or had knowledge of it, they're culpable as well. And they should be liable for damages. How that's paid or compensated and to who, I think the people of Europe deserve a stimulus check. I think Russia deserves compensation. All the parties who can claim damages for what happened, they all have a claim. That's how it should go down. That's how it should go down. But will it happen that way? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we'll see that during this Trump term. I think it would be great. It would definitely be a breath of fresh air and definitely set the world on the right track. But I don't know if we're going to see it. What's worse, though, is if it gets exposed and then they have to deny it and cover it up. So again, back to you, White House. What are you going to do about the Nord Stream sabotage? Because you better do something. Because Uncle Sam's got his fingerprints all over it. That is for certain. And if you don't think so, you're deluding yourself. And you might be able to cover your eyes and ears and say hum, hum, ho, hum for the next 3 years and kick the can down the road for the next administration. But the problem will never go away. And this will eat at the legitimacy and the foundations of NATO. So it's better to nip it in the bud now. But I'm not sure if that's going to happen. Not sure if they're ready for that to happen. But we'll continue this conversation about Europe, about Ukraine. Let me bring on stage Mr. Basil Valentine. I'll bring him up on stage now. Basil is the political editor at the Pulse.today. Basil, great to have you with us.
Great to be with you, Patrick, and hello to all your viewers and listeners all around the world.
Basil, it's great to see you. I mean, I saw a fantastic segment, which we put on our X feed, which you did from the Pulse. You interviewed Laughlin, who is a fantastic geopolitical analyst on the Pulse.
A great guy, a US skeptic academic now based in France. And he was saying what we all know, that Zelensky's history. I'm reminded of what Henry Kissinger said, to have the United States as your friend, to have the United States as your enemy can be dangerous, but to have the United States as your friend may be fatal. And that's indeed the case for Zelensky. He flew too near the sun, and like Icarus, his wings have melted, and he's falling back down to earth with a thud. But that doesn't stop, bleary-eyed commentators like Simon Tisdall in The Guardian, still proclaiming him as the heroic savior of his nation. We've got two parallel realities. On the one hand, Trump is a peacemaker. To others, he's simply an appeaser. On the one hand, I spoke also last week on the Pulse.today to Dmitry Orlov, who, for the first time I've ever heard, enunciated what could be described as the maximalist Russian position, which is that the provinces in the east of Ukraine currently occupied by Russia are now part of the Russian Federation. According to the Russian constitution, they held plebiscites, they voted to rejoin Russia. They're now part of Russia. And the only way that they could leave the Russian Federation would be if they had another plebiscite and decided to leave. And that's not going to happen. Therefore, the idea of there being so-called peacekeeping or NATO troops on Russian soil is a complete non-starter. They would be regarded as enemy forces. So there's absolute chasm between where Russia is and where elements of the West are, most particularly, of course, the United Kingdom, who've been in the vanguard of the warmongers from day one. So, the next couple of weeks are going to be absolutely crucial in terms of the way it plays out.
No, indeed. And so what do you make of this? It's kind of an unusual situation. We spoke to Thomas Fazi, fantastic journalist, writes for Unheard. He's also got a great Substack, Thomas Fazi, as well. We talked to him about this unusual situation now where Trump, the United States, is backing off the Russian aggression against Russia. They're wanting to open up détente and rapprochement with Russia, with Moscow, and Europe is just flabbergasted by this series of events, and they're like meeting and doing emergency confabs to figure out how they're going to fund to keep the war going. They're considering Washington now as kind of almost their enemy, as an appeaser. They're calling Trump Neville Chamberlain, and so. But this is my question, Basil, and I said this to Thomas Fazi, and I'll throw this to you: if Washington and Moscow are going to kiss and make up, and there's no longer a threat of nuclear war breaking out between those two parties, then what could Europe possibly have to fear from Russia if America has got it under control? In this case, the Trump administration. There's a big disconnect here. Is this permanent, or is this just throwing your toys out of the pram before eventually coming to reality? What do you make of this current situation?
Well, Europe has made the major mistake of believing its own BS, basically. Europe has somehow convinced itself, or elements of Europe, that Russia has a invasion policy for Poland, for the Baltic states, for anywhere all the way up to and including Paris and London. This is paranoid nonsense, but it doesn't stop them acting accordingly. For example, the Danes have said they want to increase their defense expenditure to 5% of GDP in the near future. The UK Defense Secretary John Healey, has been speaking to his Norwegian counterpart about deepening the military pact between Britain and Norway, extending that, and how they can cooperate to counter the Russian threat in the Arctic. Would you believe it? In France, and John Laughlin talked about this, they're talking about increasing defense expenditure from 50 billion euros a year to 150 billion. Well, they haven't got any money. France has $1 trillion or 2 or 3 trillion in national debt. So they either have to borrow the money, which pushes up the cost of borrowing, is very damaging to the economy, or they have to raise taxes, or, there's no easy way of doing so. Plus, of course, military expending has almost no benefit to the wider economy. The money isn't recycled. If governments want to spend money to stimulate the economy, then spending money on defense hardware is about the worst thing they can possibly do. It really is a black hole for money, particularly since the stuff they buy is mostly never used anyway. It just rusts. I mean, Britain built 2 new aircraft carriers. They were pretty much obsolete before they left the shipyards. The key thing really is that Trump wants to be seen as, wants his legacy to be that of a peacemaker. He's been quoting the Bible, blessed are the peacemakers and all the rest of it. Now, of course, he's got some very, very bizarre and unpleasant ideas vis-a-vis the Middle East. But when it comes to the Russians, he's definitely started off on the right foot. But Europe seems determined to, remain cast in this absurd, it's the early 1930s all over again mindset, which is completely divorced from reality. There's no evidence the Russians want to advance any further, really, than they already have. If they'd wanted to take over the whole of Ukraine, they could have easily done so by now. He also pointed out, John Laughlin, that the Russians haven't attacked any of the major cities in Ukraine. They haven't been engaged in urban warfare. They don't want to kill civilians. They don't want to destroy Ukrainian infrastructure either. On the other hand, the crazies include that bloke Merz, who may become the new Chancellor of Germany after the elections this weekend. He's talking about extending the nuclear pact, or rather making a new Anglo-German-French nuclear pact if the United States is going to withdraw. And I saw it suggested on social media that he's saying that Europe should be prepared to use nuclear weapons to defend Ukraine. Now, I can't verify that, but that's how crazy the Europeans still are.
No, indeed. They're unhinged, to say the least. And, I don't think anyone in Europe, and I made this point on a viral video I posted from an old interview from January, but there's nobody in Europe that wants to have a direct combat with the Russians, wants to go to war with Russia. The only country that's capable of doing that is probably the United States, but they're not interested in it, and not even remotely. So you have all these smaller European countries that can't even field 20 or 50,000 combat-ready soldiers, which, let's face it, that'll last about 2 weeks on the front lines in Donbass. They're not prepared even to do that. So, what are they proposing here? Are they just proposing status quo? Just keep pumping in money and weapons into Ukraine, and more dead Ukrainians and less and less Ukrainian territory left? Russia will just keep advancing.
Yeah, I thought it was very funny, really, the way Trump humiliated European leaders by saying on more than one occasion last week, look, you had 3 years to sort this out and you've done nothing, Now suddenly you want a seat at the table. You had your chance, This war should never have started in the first place. He's right about that. And now I'm going to bring it to an end. We'll find out exactly what the Europeans are proposing when Emmanuel Macron goes to the White House on Monday. And it is seen by diplomacy watchers as very significant that Macron is going to get first dibs with President Trump, and Starmer is only going later in the week. This is being interpreted as a snub to the British Prime Minister, partly because of past insults from various Labour figures aimed at Trump, and partly because Starmer is the biggest hawk in Europe, along with the likes of von der Leyen, and Kaya, callous by name and callous by nature.
She's absolutely crazy, that woman. That's the bar can't go any lower for European officials and foreign policy, Basil. It's pretty scary, actually. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they're accepting the fact grudgingly that there is going to be a ceasefire. And, no leader really likes to be honest enough to come out and say, I'm pro-war, I want more war, I want more killing. So there's a lot of sort of equivocation and hedging going on from European leaders at the moment. They're trying to make out that they're sort of not totally opposed to what Trump is doing, because to do so is painting themselves into a corner. And also what Trump's doing is popular, but not just in America, but all over Europe, in Ukraine, in Russia, everywhere. Any sane person wants to see an end to the war. So it's the European leaders, that want to keep this going, that are really out on a limb.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Well, it is interesting because the U.S. is at the same time pressuring the European countries to spend more on defense. They need to spend, and this was part of the browbeating that was happening at the Munich Security Council. They need to spend 5% of GDP. I mean, Europe's broke at the moment, and
that's right.
They're already in budget deficit, so I don't think they can really afford to spend that kind of money. And
what for as well? It's totally illogical. What we're seeing, hopefully, is peace dividend 2.0. The first one was obviously in the early 1990s when Reagan and Gorbachev managed to broker the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, a big reduction in nuclear weapons at that time. Trump has now talked about cutting military spending globally by 50% at some point in the future. Not yet, but he's made that kind of noise. If peace breaks out in Ukraine, if all that calms down and we go back to the important principles of self-determination, I mean, that's the one that the European leaders never want to hear. The Dmitry Orlov's absolutely right. The people in those eastern provinces in Ukraine voted to rejoin Russia. Why can we not have similar plebiscites all over Ukraine and see what the people want? But of course, Zelensky doesn't want any of that. So,
no, I'll just add to what you said, because it's an important point. If you watch Piers Morgan, he's doing shows on Ukraine now, and Trump, he's getting all the Ukraine hawks on and seeing what they think about this split that's going on. But when you listen to the Piers Morgan sort of base propaganda, Western propaganda narratives, which is a good thing to watch Piers Morgan, because you'll know what the propaganda that's being issued from NATO and from governments and from intelligence agencies goes directly to Piers Morgan, and then he repeats that ad nauseum. And this is how narratives are formed, including the Israeli October 7th narrative. But he says, well, look, it was Putin invaded. That's why there's a war. It's not Ukraine's fault. Putin invaded. And then if you ask Piers Morgan, you say, why did Putin invade? He didn't technically do a full-scale invasion, but they say full-scale invasion, Putin's war of choice, an unprovoked war. And that's propaganda. The reality is what you said, Basil, but it's even worse from the Piers Morgan propaganda point of view, is that the government in Kiev, what led to this major impasse and conflict, is when Petro Poroshenko came in, a U.S. installed puppet, or when the U.S. installed Yatsenyuk as the caretaker government after the Maidan coup, which was engineered by the U.S. and the EU and Soros and a few others in 2014, February. They put in a caretaker government handpicked by Victoria Nuland and the U.S. State Department. And then they held until Petro Poroshenko came in as the first president. And what he did and what they did was cut off. They did a policy of what's called lustration. They cut off the eastern regions from the democratic process. And then they cut off government services. In some cases, cut off utilities. So at that point, by international law, by the UN Charter for Self-Determination, you have a right to form your own government, your own militia, to protect your people if the country that you used to be a part of has raised an army to attack you. That happened. So they ticked all the boxes for international law. And then there was a ceasefire mandated by the UN Security Council, Resolution 2202. That's the basis of the Minsk Accords. And they need to implement the Minsk Accords. That was mandated unanimously, including the US and France and the UK. They all signed it. And then they didn't follow through with it. And they didn't follow through intentionally because they wanted this war to happen, ultimately. So all those countries in Donbass, they have a perfect case by international law. The failure is from the UN Security Council countries that didn't push to implement mixed because they voted on it. And so for people to turn around and give you 1% of the history, which is what Piers Morgan does, it's called keyhole gaslighting or keyhole history. You can only see through the keyhole, or gaslighting, if you want to use the term gaslighting, and then blame Russia for something that is the West's fault. So it's an open shut case. It's a much stronger case than the creation of Kosovo by NATO. Much stronger case. And Crimea, that's a slam dunk for Russia. Piers Morgan says Russians invaded Crimea. You hear a lot of people repeat that. They didn't invade Crimea. They were already in Crimea. The Russian Black Sea Fleet is stationed at Sevastopol. They had 20,000 troops, plus another 5,000 bureaucrats, technical people, 25,000 standing in Crimea. They didn't invade. So what happened was the people in Crimea saw the destabilization after Maidan, saw the lustration, saw the discrimination of Russian speakers and the basket case that was Kiev, and they made phone calls and arrangements. Russia says, we'll defend you enough to get yourself stable, but you have to have a referendum. If you want to be independent, you have to have a referendum. They did, and it was unanimous, 90%. Next thing you know, they're joining the Russian Federation. Slam dunk, open shut case. They were part of Russia anyway before 1953, so it is.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's the other point people forget is that, Ukraine's something of a made-up country. It was all part of the USSR. It's not like it's an ancient kingdom like France or Spain or something. It was, the border between Ukraine and Russia was all but invisible in the Soviet era, and Stalin moved populations around all over the place. There are millions of ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine. That's a fact. It's also a fact that they were being persecuted. It's a fact that they've been persecuted even more, Russian speakers, since the war started, with Zelensky closing churches and banning the use of the Russian language and all this sort of stuff. But this is how demented some of the fake liberal commentators are. This is Simon Tisdall writing in The Guardian. He says, Trump is right up there with Brutus, Benedict Arnold, Vidkun Quisling, and Lord Haw-Haw. Lord Haw-Haw, for those who don't know, a.k.a. William Joyce, was a British defector to Nazi Germany who then made regular propaganda broadcasts during the Second World War with the call sign, Germany calling, hence his name, Lord Haw-Haw. Tens of thousands of civilians are dead or injured. Millions are displaced and homeless. Yes, we know that, Simon, and it seems you want that number to increase. Now, he says, they are all Trump's victims too. I mean, what a bizarre bit of projection, really. In what way are the people that were killed or made homeless over the course of the 3 years when Trump wasn't in power, in what way are they his victims? I don't get it. Putin, he goes on, a dictator in the true sense, launched an unprovoked, they're always unprovoked. I mean, it's that watchword, isn't it, that, it must come down from the Central Information Bureau that, all corporate media hacks have to always use unprovoked as a prefix when describing the invasion. Do you know what I mean? It's a bit like saying there was no evidence of vote fraud in 2020. There's no evidence of it. Remember that one? Like October the 5th, that was a terrorist attack. That was unprovoked. Anyway, on we go. Putin, a dictator in the true sense, launched an unprovoked full-scale invasion, which it wasn't, in defiance of common sense, morality, and international law. He is committing serial war crimes, yet he's flattered and excused and told he can keep what he stole by his White House gangster bro. Trump should demand Putin's arrest along with an unconditional end to hostilities. Instead, he pays lick spittle. He's a disgrace to American democracy. I wonder what Tisdall says about Gaza.
No, it's got nothing to say about Gaza, which is another unprovoked attack by Hamas, by the occupied Palestinians, unprovoked. None of these people, all these hawks against Russia, a lot of them were people that have nothing to say about, because they say, well, after the Second World War, we were civilized. We didn't move borders. back in the medieval times, we had this chaos, and we don't live in that world anymore. Russia can't just go and take things from people, and they can't just invade and then steal the resources from countries. And I'm thinking to myself, what's the U.S. done in Iraq? What's the U.S. done in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria? Take the oil. Trump himself, take the oil. Somalia, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on and on and on. I'm not even talking about Central America, but so I mean, even in the modern era, the U.S. is guilty many times over. What about Yugoslavia? That was more in the heart of Europe than Ukraine is.
Exactly.
So
yeah, people talk about you hear again, you say, oh, this war's in the heart of Europe. No, it isn't. It's at the easternmost extremity of Europe. It isn't in the heart of Europe at all. And it's not going to come to the heart of Europe either. It's not going to come to Vienna and Switzerland or something. It's not going to happen. The minerals, of course. Well, apparently, as Zelensky said, he would not accept any outcomes of talks, and he's not ready yet to sign the mineral deal either, which Trump is pressing for. I also saw it reported last week that Ukraine wants to do a deal with Britain, believe it or not, for the minerals, because we've been the most steadfast supporter. Maybe that's why Starmer's carrying on with his absurd posturing. He wants to get his hands on some goodies.
I wouldn't be surprised. It'd be good for a change. I mean, Britain needs to get stuff to raise money. I mean, everybody needs cash. So smash and grab in Ukraine.
That's right.
Closeout sale happening now. Rare earths, natural gas, roll up, closeout sale, blue light special in Ukraine. Zelensky, speak to Volodymyr. He'll sort you out. How long does he have, by the way?
Well, good question. Vitaly Klitschko was at the European Parliament in the week collecting a distinguished mayoral award. Some saw that as a sign that he may be being maneuvered. The former world heavyweight boxing champion, he may be next in line. But, really, it's got to be elections in Ukraine, simple as that. And there's no reason why they shouldn't, come hard on the heels of a ceasefire. And if Zelensky gets re-elected, okay, well, then we have to continue to deal with him. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily trust the outcome of any such Ukrainian election. I think we can expect a fair amount of meddling. Meanwhile, the US-Russia reset continues to gather pace. Preparations are now underway for a face-to-face meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, according to Russia's deputy foreign minister, a move that, of course, marks a dramatic shift away from Western isolation of Moscow, which has been ongoing for the last 3 years. Sergei Rybakov said the possible Putin-Trump summit could involve broad talks on global issues and not just Ukraine. He said a possible Putin-Trump summit is now going to move towards normalizing relations between our countries, finding ways to resolve the most acute and potentially very, very dangerous situations, of which there are many Ukraine amongst them. And he said efforts to organize such a meeting are only at an early stage, and that making it happen will require the most intensive preparatory work. I wonder what the likes of Simon Tisdall will say about that. The leaders of the world's two most powerful countries meeting, shaking hands, agreeing to solve the world's problems. That'll put these neoliberal hawks, kicking and screaming on the sidelines. We don't want a peaceful world. We don't want to sort the problems out.
Putin can't be seen to win.
That's
After
right.
all we've sacrificed, Europe has sacrificed so much to defeat this evil Russian, the hordes, the Slavic hordes from coming over the Alps. Not a word about any dead Ukrainians. Did you notice that? You never hear this from any of the Eurocrats or anybody in the West lamenting about how many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian boys and men or grandfathers have been sacrificed on the front lines of this vanity war that NATO is waging.
Exactly.
Vanity. It's a vanity project. That's the way I look at this.
Yes.
For Europe. For America, it's a protection racket. At least with America, it's a protection racket. But with Europe, it's a vanity project. For what? The ego of past empires,
well, I mean, it was a failed American project. It became a European vanity project, but originally it was, Victoria Newland's brainchild, wasn't it? It was all part of the, let's continue to squeeze Russia as hard as possible. Carle, the new EU foreign policy chief, has talked about breaking Russia up. The idea really was that we didn't want a multipolar world. If Russia was, decapitated in much the same way that other countries like Iraq and Libya have been decapitated, admittedly much bigger fish, but why couldn't the same thing happen there, you see? And we end up instead with 10 or 15 small client vassal states, which can be dominated and consumed by the World Economic Forum, the European Union, CIA, or whoever. So it was the fact that Russia existed as this major alternative power bloc that really, and Ukraine was just the hired muscle, as it were, to start trying to push them around. But they haven't been pushed around, and now it's time to bring it to an end, and also to hopefully close the chapter on the stupid, senseless, so destructive regime change ideology of the neocons.
Yeah, we hope so. Anyway, it's a promising start. I hope they follow through with it. I would hate to be disappointed with everyone's hopes.
One last little vignette, because it is worth talking about the constructive things that are happening. Russia could agree to using $300 billion of sovereign assets, which have been frozen by the European Union, for reconstruction in Ukraine, but insists that part of the money is spent on the 1/5 of the country that has now become part of Russia. So that would be, that's the kind of creative thinking that's needed, isn't it?
Yeah, it's in Russia's interest to do that, by the way, and they'll want a hand in the construction, and so that means that
money talks. Money talks.
Yep.
Patrick, do you know what I mean? $240 billion.
Well, laying cement.
Changes a lot of people's minds, doesn't it?
Laying cement, laying foundations, getting the Teamsters in. Trump knows all about that. That's talking his language, that's for sure. So I think he can deal with the Russians on that end of the deal. It's just getting things to a point where people are going to accept the outcome. That's the big challenge right now, because a lot of reputations, a lot of vanity is at stake, as we said. So I'm not holding our breath for Europe. I think they're just going to have to learn the hard way, maybe at the ballot box in the case of some of these countries. But Basil, we're going to wrap this segment up, and it's been a great Sunday Wire, by the way. But any final thoughts? Any impressions about things going on out there you want to share with us?
Well, Zelensky said he had a productive talk with Keir Starmer ahead of Starmer's trip to Washington, and finished by saying the UK and its people are amongst Ukraine's biggest supporters. Well, not all of us, Vladimir. Does that put me in the crosshairs of your Secret Service if I say that?
Well, certainly. I've been on a few SBU
hit lists.
Propaganda lists, of Western journalists that are enemies of Ukraine. So,
hopefully all that's going to go away. This is the thing. We just need all this to go away.
Well, half of it has gone away because half of those were USAID funded. So I was on one confirmed USAID funded blacklist of Western journalists and political pundits. And so now that the funding's been pulled, I hope that Doge got their little scalpel into that program, but that stuff will just go away. It was jobs for ne'er-do-wells, whether they're Ukrainian, Eastern European, or people in Washington, that were actually doing it. So who knows? We'll find out. There needs to be an investigation. This has just been a free-for-all of grift, of free-for-all. That's what Ukraine is. It's a giant cash machine. For the political class.
Well, again, that's what Dmitry Orlov was saying. He was saying the Europeans have gone home with suitcases full of money. Quite literally, the whole thing has just been an exercise in bribery and corruption, and all this talk of sovereignty and the politics of it. It's just window dressing for a giant gangster operation.
Absolute. You know what?
with Zelensky's well-rumored habits, of course.
Oof. Yeah, I mean that's there's. I like to get some accounting on that, but it'll probably be on the books as fruit and flowers, like it is with show business. Fruit and flowers, fresh fruit and flowers every day, for a grand. Flown in with Sean Penn. What was he bringing Zelensky? What was inside that Oscars trophy? That's what everybody wants to know. But anyway, maybe we'll find out. Maybe Sean will do a documentary and tell us all those answers to all those esoteric Ukrainian questions there. Just before we go, all jokes aside, just a couple things. You mentioned the church. We'll flash this up on screen here. Fantastic independent documentary film about Zelensky's takedown of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Religious repression in that country at the hands of this so-called democratic leader. I mean, it's just unbelievable if you actually think about it, but this is what's happened. The largest religious institution in the country was banned by Zelensky, this champion of democratic values. So that happened, ladies and gentlemen, and it's called People of Christ, Our Time. It's an independent documentary. We're very pleased to have this great review of this film up at 21st Century Wire. The film itself is accessible on YouTube, but to censor it, YouTube has put an 18 or over age limitation on it. Just one of the little roadblocks that YouTube does to content they don't like or they don't want people to see. The other story, and Basil, you probably know about this man, Gonzalo Lira.
Yeah, well, I'm very glad he got some space in social media this week, because, again, Trump's moves have brought an awful lot of things out into the open. Poor bloke.
No, it's just really sad. He was an American, Chilean American, but he was in Ukraine. He became a kind of voice of the dissenting opinion from inside Ukraine during this conflict, and he sadly, according to Alexander Dubinsky here, Dubinsky's in jail. Zelensky threw him in jail for whistleblowing corruption. Yeah, that's your Democratic champion, Zelensky. He's thrown all the dissidents in prison. So Dubinsky is an interesting character. He was a parliamentarian. Okay, he was a people's deputy in the Rada, and he's in prison. When he was going to one of his hearings with his lawyer there, he uploaded a video to YouTube while they were together with evidence about what they did to Gonzalo Lira. Tortured him to death. Before they killed him, they extorted $70,000 of all his savings in money. They got him to extract it online and then wire it to whoever the security guards or whatever corrupt grifters you have in the Ukrainian intelligence apparatus. They took an American citizen, they beat him, robbed him, and tortured him to death and killed him. And you know what the worst part about this is, and Dubinsky mentions this, the U.S. State Department had full knowledge of this, his detainment beforehand. They did nothing to release him. They could have saved his life on multiple occasions, and Anthony Blinken and everybody in the State Department laughed it off and said, well, tough luck. Leave him to the dogs. And sure enough, this is what happened. I mean, there should be a Senate hearing or a congressional hearing on this and other issues related to this last State Department, which I will say is probably going to go down history, and this is a tough award to win, the most corrupt and criminal State Department history in the history of the country. And that's an award that's tough to dole out, Basil. It's not an easy one to win.
Yeah,
that's it's like breaking think of a great feat in sports history that nobody's been able to eclipse. I mean, that's how difficult it is to win that award. Worst State Department, most corrupt criminal Secretary of State ever, Tony Blinken. I think he wins. I think he makes Henry Kissinger look like, what do you call it, a Samaritan, volunteering, doing suicide hospice and hotline, for 20 years. I mean, that's the equivalent. Tony Blinken is just something of a real criminal, a really dark character, connected to Jeffrey Epstein, by the way. Via the French connections there. That's another thing that's coming out now. Well, we got plenty to talk about on that front, I hope.
Yeah,
Or
I mean,
not.
the only good thing about Blinken is, his reputation is that of a genocide enabler. That's his legacy. He doesn't have anything else. He will never recover from it in the eyes of the global public, But doubtless, neocon universities will give him a few $1,000s to deliver the odd speech. He'll join one of those think tanks, no doubt, but he cannot claim now, at any point going forward, anything other than the most disgraceful record of any Secretary of State.
Yeah, no, it's pretty incredible. Pretty incredible. So those are two things.
Before we go, I just want to mention that we're back at the Pulse. The Pulse today, the home of today's news talk, is back, broadcasting from 3 p.m. to 9 p.m. GMT. That's a UK time, Monday to Friday. And I'm on every day at 6 p.m. for a couple of hours. And I look forward to seeing you there. I've got the redoubtable, the indefatigable, the venerable Professor Jim Fetzer on Tuesday. And I'm going to be asking him what, if anything, we can expect from the so-called opening up of US files on the assassination of John Kennedy and various other misdemeanors. I'm not expecting too much, but of course, Jim is the dean of so-called conspiracy theory. I'm glad to say that term is becoming increasingly redundant, simultaneously redundant and embraced by people. Conspiracy theorists are simply those who can see a year or two into the future and 50 years into the past more clearly than the others. Hey, Patrick. So anyway, Jim Fetzer on next week. A whole host of great guests. It's a rip-roaring show, and I'm there 6 p.m. every day at the Pulse.today.
Yeah, we put that up on screen as well for people to see. Just go to that URL, thepulse.today. It's down there on Basil's lower third as well. Ask Jim Fetzer one question for me, if you would, please. Basil, ask him what are the dangers that they release quite a lot of documents, but they'll be redacted? Because they do have an Israeli-friendly congresswoman with a fake name, by the way, basically
right.
in charge of it. So I mean, it's
former stripper, apparently.
Former stripper Anna Meyerhofer, now known as Anna Paulina Luna, because you need to win that Latino vote in Southern Florida. So you need to change the name. It's show business, right? Politics is the new Hollywood. What are the odds that she might preside over a mass redaction? That's the question to Fetzer. I'd love to hear his opinion on that.
Well, I think it's going to be the classic sort of limited hangout. There'll be very, very minor release of things at the margins. But if enough comes out to successfully discredit the official narrative around JFK, then that opens the can of worms, as it were, and people start digging around much more. I mean, as I've said before, I've noticed on X, far more people now talking about the Israeli connection to the assassination of John Kennedy than was the case 5 or 10 years ago, even 2 or 3 years ago. That will only increase, so.
And 9/11.
Indeed.
9/11 as well, the Israeli connection. So, and there's a number of strong Israeli connections. So is all the Israeli details going to get redacted?
Well, this is it,
That's our fear. Is Bibi going to have first dibs on the docks? Is Bibi going to have first dibs on the docks? That's our big fear. That's what we're worried about.
I mean, this is what annoys me about people like Simon Tisdall here sounding off about Vladimir Putin, when Netanyahu is, guilty of far more grotesque and cruel war crimes than Putin. And you would think that at least if he wanted to appear an honest broker or writer like that, would mesh the two together and talk about the global constitutional crisis if he wants to. Do you know what I mean?
The problem is you can't put them side by side, because then you'll realize that Putin isn't the evil butcher that they're making him out to be in the West, because Netanyahu has just distinguished himself above and beyond anything we've seen in the modern era. So
that's right.
It's no wonder they don't compare them. They don't even want to mention them in the same sentence, by the way. That's like the biggest fear of these propagandists, Basil. We're here to hold them to account. We're here to expose their lies, all their deceptions, all their obfuscations, and their gaslighting. And I think we're doing a pretty good job of it, because the truth is coming out little by little, bit by bit, thanks to many different people and the great hard work and dedication of many, an independent researcher, independent journalist, pundit, people in politics as well, the brave ones. We tip our hats to everybody, and people like yourself. Basil Valentine, political editor at The Pulse. Today, good luck this week. Look forward to hearing about your Fetzer segment, hopefully next week.
Thank you, Patrick. See you again soon.
Should be noteworthy. There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. That is Basil Valentine. And again, go to thepulse.today. You can go to the URL there. That'll take you to see some great programming, great content, very smart and heady analysis happening there. And let me just remind everybody, we are having a winter fundraising drive at 21st Century Wire. This is how we support this platform and our team throughout the year. This is where it's at. You just go to 21stcenturywire.com, donate, support. We'll accept any form of payment. We'll do cryptocurrency, PayPal, credit card, whichever. We appreciate it. We'll put it to great use, I assure you. And we've got a couple more weeks left. We're going to round this out at the end of February. So if you can support us or subscribe and become a member for around $5 a month at 21wire.tv, that's one way you can help us on a regular rolling basis. And we got some great members content there as well. And we'll be rolling out a whole new suite on that platform for members as soon as we're able to. But we are putting out new programming. The Midweek Wire, it's in its 5th week. That's really exciting. People are loving it. So we're going to keep doing it and pushing it out further and further. And we got a 3rd program we're going to be launching as well, probably in the next week or so. So we're putting some new stuff out, and we've got our viral video suite as well. We have a team working on those every day. So again, that's all thanks to you. Couldn't do it without your help, folks. And we want to do a whole lot more, and we're going to need your help to do it. So we really appreciate everybody. And also a big thank you, not only to Basil Valentine today, but also Thomas Fazi, journalist from Unheard. Also, Thomas has his own Substack, which we put on screen earlier, Thomas Fazi. You can find it there. We'll put a link down in the show description as well. But that's all we have time for today, ladies and gentlemen. That is the show. We appreciate your patronage and your listenership, your viewership, and we will see you in the midweek. We have actually a very special Nord Stream report, which will be published at 21stcenturywire.com, and we'll have the author on the Midweek Wire to discuss what his findings are, and they will be profound, I guarantee it. It's an important piece of the story which we'll be revealing this week, and Freddie Ponton will be there to tell us all about it on the Midweek Wire on 21 Wire Live, same platforms and channels as the Sunday Wire today. So we'll see you all then. So in the meantime, take care. Hope you guys have a great week. All the best.
Gratitude, the antidote, the world is built on fear. The evil world we live in wants our soul to disappear. But gratitude, salvation, a never-ending light that transcends all the darkness trying to hold us to the night. Thoughts say what is missing, thank you says what's here. Thoughts keep us unconscious, thank you makes it clear. Back into the moment, the vast eternal now, where God is always with us and holy like a cow, like a sunrise or a child or a garden full of roses. The mind misses the magic and considers all the poses. Why our thoughts against us, principalities are there, whispering indifference on foundations of despair. So thank you is my mantra, mantra. Na 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 na. mantra, mantra. Who set up this funhouse, this journey for our soul, where most never make it and lose all their control? How do we get back any sovereignty from the lies of demons that we pretend to be? Thank you is a pass to a place outside of hell. Gratitude and presence will lift us where we fell, but we have to make a practice to come back into now, in the garden of our gratitude, and push that ancient plow. I don't know the reason we are in a holy war, how we ever come back to who we were before. Did it start in Eden with an apple and a snake? Since then, have we been following with this battle as our fate? So thank you is my mantra, mantra. Na 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 na. Thank you is my mantra, mantra. The world will light us, and so will our minds. So will our minds. Whatever is the reason, this is where we are. The light and the darkness are aiming for our heart. The light wants us present in the clutch of gratitude. The darkness wants us scattered with an evil attitude. And we look at the thinking that justifies the course. We see it's thought itself that brings on the divorce. From the Holy Spirit, from revelations gloom, from the love of God to the darkness of the tomb. Voices of all demons we identify as us, and then we follow lies, the wrong voices that we trust. Take us to destruction, take us to despair, when the gift that God himself has always just been here. So thank you is my mantra, mantra. Na 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 na. Thank you is my mantra, mantra. Thank you is my mantra, mantra. Na 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 na. Thank you is my mantra, mantra. this say about who we are? 'Cause this might be the last time to raise a hand about who we are. What's this say about who we are? Digital images and digital lies cut out their heart along with their supply. The propaganda leads to dehumanization.